It's so great to be here today with Lily Rothman, who will join us in a minute. So it's been a rough couple of weeks. The world has been horrified and riveted by the unfolding events in Israel and Gaza. It's hard to look at the situation without feeling helpless and hopeless, not just for Jews and Palestinians, but for humanity writ large. But as Ruth Messenger, who's an aspiring political activist, has said, despair is not a strategy. For working journalists, despair is not an option, not when you're grappling with history in real time. How does that work? We are so privileged today to hear from Lily Rothman, managing editor of Time magazine. So I'm looking forward to diving in. Lily, welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you
so
for
nice
having
to
me.
see. Our pleasure. So the first time I interviewed Lily was in 2001. I was a TV critic for the New York Times, and Lily was a 15-year-old sophomore at Hunter High School. It was for an article, How Adolescents Watch TV, at a time when cable television had completely changed viewing habits. Lily not only watched, she wrote. I think she did a fanzine about Buffy the Vampire Slayer. But newspapers and magazines, as we once knew them, were about to radically change as well. Time magazine has survived all that change. It's now in its 100th year. Lily, you founded Time's history section and recently announced a partnership with Made by History, a leading platform that looks at the history behind the news. So I wonder if you could just start by telling us, as somebody on the inside, how do you see the magazine's role today? Time magazine, this vaunted name in journalism, versus even 20 years ago. And what is the news anyway when you're competing with TikTok and Instagram and, God forbid, X? So let me hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of what is the news anyway is a very important one that I don't have the answer to. I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about what is the news, but it changes constantly. And I think that's the question that we sort of try to answer every day. You know, what is the news? What do people need to know right now? As far as what is Time, the way that we try to see it now is that, so as you mentioned, Time magazine was founded in 1923. We're celebrating our 100th anniversary year this year and have done some really cool projects looking back to that history and, you know, spending a lot of time thinking about what it looks like going forward. One of the things people say, you know, at our staff things pretty frequently is that we're like a 100-year-old startup at this point. That it's really the beginning of a phase, even though we're 100 years old. And one of the things I think is nice about Time as an outlet is that the magazine, we still publish in print and deliver to subscribers' homes, and you can find us on newsstands. You know, and we're all over the world in print. And that's a really important part of the ecosystem. But Time magazine is only one element of what Time is at the moment. And obviously that means our website, which I think in practice, though not for everybody, I think some of our readers we hear do still get the news from a magazine that, you know, comes to their home, not every day or every hour, but we know that most people, or a lot of people, get their news from the internet on a minute by minute basis, and it's just a really different brain muscle to exercise, to think about covering the news as it's happening, as opposed to marking this week in history. So they're sort of, we think a lot about how those two things play together, and figuring out a way to present the news that we're reporting every day on the internet to our print readers in a way that works for them, whether you pick up the magazine when it arrives or, you get to it the next week or after that. And even those are only two parts of sort of the ecosystem. We're also doing more live events. We have a really thriving documentary department that does all kinds of great video projects. So all kinds of things. And I think that going forward, the news is something that people will consume in many different ways. Podcasts. We have a podcast called Person of the Week, which is a great one-on-one interview podcast, kind of playing with our idea of, Person of the Year is the most influential person of the year. Person of the Week is sort of a person who is doing something interesting and influential every week. So yeah, and we try to find sort of common threads between the different elements and make them all work together. But yeah, I think the answer to your question is, Time Magazine is still has a lot of the elements that it had in 1923. But now it's only one part of a larger thing.
So it's interesting. I know you have, and we are at the virtual Center for Jewish History at the American Jewish Historical Society, and you started Time's history section. And I've loved reading your pieces over the years. You write, you always seems to me to write about culture and trends. And yet now your job probably entails a lot of different aspects of history in the making, as well as history in the past. And so I wish you could talk a little bit about what does it mean to be managing editor of Time? And given this new partnership with Made in History, how do you sort of balance that idea of news and news as we'll think about it, 10 or 100 years from now?
Yeah, I think, so just sort of the background on the history section, we launched it on time.com, I think it was 2014, late 2014. And at the time I was an entertainment reporter and I had studied history as an undergrad. And, I always liked history. And it came about in sort of a roundabout way. We had recently digitized the PDFs of all of our physical, back issues. And we're thinking about how can we tell readers we have this really cool thing where you can find pictures of almost every issue of Time going back to 1923 on our website. And one of the ideas was, well, we can have a section on the website where we write about, maybe it's this day in history or just cool things that we find, and tell readers that this is out there and they can use it. And they needed someone to run that project, and I kind of raised my hand and we started that. But it became clear pretty quickly that this sort of cool archive finds thing was going to be a very small part of what a history vertical looks like. And actually around that time, I think this was like in the zeitgeist or something. The Washington Post and the Atlantic, the New Yorker got a history editor. There was something going on with history in news ecosystem in that kind of like mid 2010s, which is a great community. There was sort of a great community to be a part of. But anyway, we realized that there was a lot of news coverage to be done that was kind of explaining the stories behind the news. And sometimes that would be, here's what Time said about X in 1963, and that help you understand. And it's kind of a cool primary source because it's something that was, journalism is supposedly the first draft of history. And this is an interesting perspective on what people at the time what journalists thought about what was going on in the world, and also what you would imagine an American consumer of Time magazine would be receiving informationally about what was going on in the world. So there's some interesting stuff to be learned there. But yeah, so we just kind of realized that there's a lot to be said about the history behind the news. And the partnership you mentioned with Made by History, which we just launched in September, is a great way to continue that. They're a group of professional historians who sort of run their own history behind the news platform. All the pieces that they produce are written and edited by professional historians. They kind of replicate the experience of peer review, knowing that everything you read is written by a historian and edited by multiple historians and reviewed by colleagues, but with a general readership audience. So we now have been running, we run 4 or 5 pieces from them on our site every week. And it's been really great so far. And I think it's only going to continue. They're they are sort of doing a takeover of our history newsletter, it goes out on Thursday afternoon. So today is their first one. But what's also nice about that is that, I think of the history section a little bit as my baby, and I don't really have time to focus on it these days. But I'm very glad that an extremely qualified group of professional historians are making sure that our history coverage on the site stays lively. And I enjoy reading what they produce too.
That's great. And so what is your day like? I mean, what does it mean to coordinate all these different things, especially in a time like this when you're dealing with, I mean, maybe now we're always dealing with heartbreaking stories, but it feels like this is a very hot moment news-wise. So what is it that you do?
I do a couple of things. I think probably, well, it's hard to change week to week how the percentage breaks down, but a big part of it is the work of deciding or helping to decide which parts of the coverage that we're producing for the web end up in print, and how those all go together, and how everything will be done in time to, get to the plant by the deadline. We try to have the reporters focus primarily on deadlines for web instead of print. So it means sort of having my hands in everything so that I know, oh, this story is going to be ready on this day and it's going to be this long. And, we've committed to XYZ, and so we can fit it into the magazine here. This story is going to be web only. And just communicating that. I mean, I guess most of my job is just over communicating, like telling everybody everything, making sure somebody doesn't raise a red flag. Oh, there's a problem with that story. It won't be ready in time. Making sure our editor-in-chief is happy with the lineup and everything, so that the magazine can be produced efficiently without taking away from the daily work that everyone is doing. So that's a big part of it. And then the other part of it is overseeing kind of the operations team in our newsroom, figuring out what kind of meetings do we need to be having, who's in them, how do we communicate about it, how do our fact-checking and copy editing teams interact with the other editors and writers, if there anything that people are doing that is annoying them or wasting their time, and how can we avoid that. So a lot of just talking to people and trying to know what everybody is up to and how I can help it happen more easily.
You make it sound very calm and orderly.
Sometimes it is. I try very hard to keep it calm and not always orderly, but as calm as it can be. Because sometimes the rest of it, you can't control how calm it is. So at least I can try to make, the meetings that you have to go to less a source of stress.
Yeah. So I think the first time I met you or became aware of you was when you were a member of the Village Temple Children's Choir. And I wonder, we are at the American Jewish Historical Society. How do you think being Jewish has affected you in your life and in your work, if at all?
So actually, this question I had, like you hinted that this is something that everybody gets asked at this. And my first reaction was, being Jewish has been a big part of my life, but I don't think there's been any professional anything. But then I did think of something, which I think has been, it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. I don't know what's the cause and what's the effect. And I also don't know whether the source originally of this is, actual religious activities, or maybe a summer camp production of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. But I think something that has always resonated with me a lot, and that I remember learning as a kid, and just sort of like whenever I have cause to think about it as an adult, I think how important it is also is, and at Passover every year, the idea that, and I can't like quote it, but that, there came a Pharaoh who didn't remember Joseph, and that the start of the Passover story being a consequence of having forgotten the history. And I think that that's like, when I think about the ways in which I use history in my job about the news and like my interest in history, I think that, that's sort of a reminder of why it matters to not forget this stuff and to understand and learn about and care about the origins of things. Because, the idea of like this idea comes from lots of places and many people have had this idea, but the idea that, if you don't know what the history is, you might do something bad or repeat it or, cause harm. So I think that was the what I thought of. And I do think the original origin of the way that the interest in that story may go back to my appearance as I think I was the baker in Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. It has like one line. But yeah, so that I think that's one way in which I sort of identify Jewishly with my job.
Well, and I guess the question I've been thinking about all week, thinking about talking to you today, is with so much of the news right now being focused so much on the Middle East and on Israel in particular and Gaza, has being Jewish added an extra dimension of understanding or angst or whatever to thinking about the coverage of it?
I'm sure it has, in ways that I probably have not really like processed yet to be able to articulate it. I think that in some ways, being in the journalism industry, you can't really turn off the news during the day. Like at night, you can stay off social media, but you don't have the option of saying, I'm gonna. Well, I don't know. My office is very supportive of mental health, and if I needed a mental health day, I could take it. But generally, you can't. During the workday, you have to be looking at pictures that are very disturbing and reading news that's very disturbing when there's something disturbing happening in the world, and you kind of are face to face with it all day. But at the same time, I think I don't want to say that journalists have a distance between themselves and the news. But for myself personally, I find that when I have, a deadline to hit, that you kind of go into action mode, and that in so many moments in life when something hard is happening, doing something is more comfortable than simply like consuming what's happening and having it just come at you with nothing to do. And, for better or worse, saying, well, 6 captions need to be written by 5 p.m. is a thing to focus on instead of, sitting with the news for me. And I think part of that comes from I have, I guess it's a privilege in my job that I'm not the person having the difficult conversations with people on the ground. I'm not a reporter who's on the phone. And I know that, some of my colleagues have had, like one of my colleagues said that she has had like the most difficult interviews of her career this week covering this story. And I don't have to do that. And I'm not on the phone. I'm not directly editing the story as the story editor. I'm just sort of coming in and saying, here's your deadline. So I get to kind of like, I think I'm insulated from it a bit. So yeah, I think I'm sure the answer to your question is yes, but I don't really know how.
Yeah. Well, and then I guess the follow-up question to that is during the day, you're really busy and you're in the middle of the news, and and when you go home, you said you can, turn off social media at the least, but in a way, is that you have to, as you're turning off, do you have to lower some kind of barrier or something, or how do you keep it from consuming you?
Well, I mean, the reality in the last couple of days has been that I haven't been able to turn it off, but I've continued the same like work focus on what needs to get done in the evening, just because of the amount that there has been to do. I guess part of it is practice from the last few years that with COVID and the war in Ukraine, there have been so many things that we've covered that are difficult. And I think, especially with COVID during, lockdown and everything, that I got some practice in saying, my day is over, I'm going to go watch Great British Baking Show. Which, I don't know if it might be, I don't know what the healthiest response is, but, finding ways to turn off a little bit. And then I also have a toddler at home, and he is a distraction. And, when you're focused on bedtime or whatever, it's very hard to think about other things. So, yeah, that helps with exercising different parts of my brain during the different times of the day.
Well, so that leads me to a question I was going to ask you. So you're the child of a very busy working mother, who I'll talk about in a minute, but you grew up in this situation, and now you're in it yourself. You have a toddler, you have a very demanding job. So 2 questions. How do you juggle all of that? You talked about it a little bit, but even more detail, like how do you manage to do that crazy balancing act of, being a good parent and spouse and doing your job well? And do you think you do it differently than your own mother did?
So I think I like the second half of your question, because I think the answer is no. I mean, I think that, and I think she's listening to this, so I'll be curious what she says after. But I think some of the logistics are different from how my own mother did this, partly because, in the 80s, she wasn't getting emails from her boss in the middle of the night. But not that my boss emails me in the middle of the night. But work happens. And so that was different. And, the childcare arrangement we had was a little different than what we do. And my dad's job was not 9 to 5 and my husband's is. So that there were some differences, but I think in general, like my mom was also worked in magazines and when I was growing up. And I think both in my personal experience and in things that I have read about, the all kinds of working parent stuff, I do think that I got a lot out of seeing my mom be both a very capable and present mom and also a very accomplished professional, and seeing that, and I mean for any parent, but I think particularly for women who are parents, that having children see that is very valuable. And, yesterday morning, when we were publishing the Israel cover story that we published this week online, and we were trying to get it up before the workday started, and there were some little final things that I needed to be paying attention to a computer for. I certainly felt guilty that I wasn't like being present in the morning, but overall, I don't feel a lot of angst about being a working mom. I feel like, especially for a son, to see his mother be professionally ambitious and also present at home is like very valuable. And I also think, so in reverse order, getting back to the beginning of your question, that like the logistics. So I have my son's in daycare all day. I love daycare, and he loves it too. My parents are local and very helpful when needed. And my husband is, fully, like, he works a demanding job too, but he's fully, like, we are equal parents. Or at least I think it comes out in the wash when it's not equal. So that is, it wouldn't be possible otherwise. And also my office is very supportive of parents. And like, I think there's a balance that it's very demanding, but it's very flexible, and kind of once you've established the trust that you're going to get your work done, people support you doing what you need to do when you need to do it, if someone is sick or something. And I think also to the point about my husband being, pulling his weight, that he also grew up with a mom in a very demanding, she's a doctor, very demanding profession. And I think seeing his feminism and attitude towards, like, of course I have a demanding job, and I think that, I hope that that will translate also to our son, that when he grows up, he'll think like there's that, in terms of in the home with the gender division of labor, that with professional labor and home labor, that the gender of the parent, it in practice it matters sometimes, but it should not matter very much. That is a long-winded answer to your question.
No, not at all. It's a big subject, and I'm just curious, when are the times that you think it matters gender-wise?
Oh, no, I just mean that in the world. I think I know from reading things, and less so in my personal life, but you see it in your friends or in yourself and stuff, that I don't know what the statistic is, but when the kid is sick, like, who stays home, that kind of thing, which I think I don't, when it's me staying home, I don't begrudge it. And there are reasons for everything that way. But I think stuff like that
Yeah.
in the world, it is not equal.
So, so you mentioned your parents being close by, and full disclosure, I've known your parents a long time and I'm very fond of them. And in fact, your mother, Susie Bulletin, published one of my books. So special gratitude there. So it's interesting, since you have performed in Joseph and the Many Colored Coat, and you are in journalism. So just to tell the audience, Lily's parents, her mother, Susie Bulletin, was for many, many years the editor-in-chief of Workman Books and had a long and illustrious career in journalism, especially magazines herself. And her father, John Rothman, is a very, very well-respected actor, and in fact serves on the New York board of the Screen Actors Guild. And so, Lily, you had these two role models. How did you choose which path to take?
Oh, I was never going to be an actor. I like to watch plays, and as a kid, I really liked, and through high school and stuff, for fun. But I don't think I have it in me. I don't think I can take the rejection. And not that journalism doesn't include rejection, but I don't know. I just personality-wise, I was not suited for a life on the stage.
Yeah. It's sort of like, we don't like you.
Yeah. I did do some in college, some costume design for the school theater group, and sort of flirted with, I like this, but no, I think just personality. So
I think it was last year you wrote this great piece called "It's Harder Than Ever to Care About Anything," which I thought was really good. Could you tell us a little bit about the piece and your frame of mind that led you to write that article? And has anything changed in the last year for you?
Yeah, so I enjoyed working on that piece. I try to write, at least once a year or so when I can, even though that's not really my job anymore. And so this was the original idea came, well, a big chunk of it came from conversations at work about noticing, and this is not just time, like if you look it up, there are charts all over of news consumption in the last couple of years, and news traffic to news sites, and the way news performs on social media, that we just saw that after COVID, after the Trump presidency, a lot of people seem to be really burnt out on news, and not interested in reading the news. And I think even those of us in the news business, we're kind of like, oh my God, too much news. Please stop having news. And kind of wanted to take a deep breath from that. But then I just sort of felt like the things, so after COVID, I mean, I know COVID is still happening, or very much still happening, but as the sort of height of the pandemic faded away, I also just kind of anecdotally and personally was seeing kind of a difficulty in re-engaging, or sort of figuring out, well, this is what I did before I didn't see anyone for a year, and now what do I want to do after? What do I care about? And kind of feeling like what's happening in culture and in my city and stuff that I actually am interested in, rather than sitting at home and watching TV. And so I sort of started poking around to see whether there's any, whether that was just me. And I found some evidence that it wasn't. And both from surveys, I think I might not remember this correctly, but I think one of the more interesting surveys I found was a poll that's done annually on sort of what issues do Americans think are the most important issues, and that even the 3 issues that people said were the most important ones, they thought were less important than the important issues the year before. So like the economy, people say, well, that's the most important issue, but I don't care about it as much as I used to care about it. Anyway, so stuff like that. So the article was just kind of exploring that phenomenon and talking a bit to psychologists and social scientists about both what can help people re-engage and why it's so important, and kind of the takeaway being that happy people engage more with the world and all sorts of things, and that in fact, and it's a sort of virtuous cycle, that the more you engage, the caring about things makes you happier, and being happier makes you care more. And sort of it's a mental health question, not really a news consumption question. So yeah, that was I got to talk to Roz Chast about it because she had done a cartoon that I thought kind of spoke to the issue. So that was a fun interview. And my memory is she was optimistic about it. She thought people were going to start caring again.
And how do you feel about it? I mean, it's been a year later. Do you just, I mean, obviously you're not going to do all that research again, but just anecdotally from your own friends and from what you see, do you think that there has been a shift of re-engagement?
Yeah, I think to a certain extent. I think it might not look exactly the same. And obviously some of the underlying, national and global mental health trends are still at sort of crisis level. But I think people are paying attention to that. And I think, I think to a certain extent, people are caring about things.
So let me ask you something. I've thought about this a lot because, young people are always saying to me, asking me questions about how to get a job in journalism. And I think I have no idea today because things have changed so radically since when I started back in the 20th century. And I was wondering, though, for you, what advice would you give a high school or a college student who's thinking about a career in journalism?
I think it's a tricky question. But I guess the advice I would give people would be to just sort of think outside the box, that if the things that draw you to journalism are getting to learn about all kinds of things, getting to talk to people all over the world, getting to tell interesting stories, that stuff is still, people still want that. And it's still very necessary, or more necessary than ever. So I certainly wouldn't discourage anyone who that's what they want. But I hope that some young person is having some idea of, well, I want to interview people and I want to tell their stories, but I'm going to invent a new way to do it. That we need people who are thinking creatively about the vehicles for those stories and the business models that will support them. So I hope there are many, many young people out there who are thinking about that stuff and are going to come in and invent a whole new advertising model that is going to be great and sustain us for 100 years.
Well, I love that. And so I guess I meant to ask you this earlier. I mean, if you look back on, if you think about your job, just sort of stepping back a little bit, what to you are the parts that make you feel this is great and I love doing this and this is a wonderful job? And then what are the parts that make you think, oh, why didn't I become a historian or an actor?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned the acting thing, because I have often thought that the moments that it's the most fun or the most rewarding, sometimes it's like not a fun story, but when it's most rewarding and engaging are when you get that sort of like, let's put on a show feeling. When, you know, you have your editor and the writer and the photo editor and the video person and a designer, and you have a deadline and you're all in it and you're working together and you're creating something, and then you kind of put it out in the world and you think, there it is, like, great, let's do it again. And that kind of feeling, which you can have about any story when it works, is very rewarding. And so, yeah, I think, and then also just when you, the other feeling that's very rewarding is something, so a colleague of mine coined this, so I can't take credit for it, but when you have an aha story, so when you read or write something and you recognize your own feeling in it, but it's like articulated better, and then you feel kind of a connection, and whether it's coming from like a celebrity who had that thought or somebody, you know, somebody's trend piece or whatever it is, that's very rewarding. So yeah, that's I think those are some of the bits that I think that, you know, sometimes people don't return your calls.
Yeah, yeah. So sadly, we're getting towards the end of this, but I did want to just, before we go, this has been really terrific. You know, this interview will become part of the HAHS archive. And as somebody who's a history buff, I was wondering, you talked about it a little bit before, but just, you know, in this crazy world where things seem to be old news, you know, 2 seconds ago, what do you think is the value of preserving history? I mean, what is it that you think we're trying to do? Not we,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
you, me, every, you know, those of us in this kind of work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to sort of what we were talking about before of, or I guess on like a macro level globally, that preserving history helps us do better in the future. But then I think also, I don't know, like, why do people like to tell stories about things that are happening and learn about what's happening in the world? That it just seems like a kind of innate thing that everybody gets a lot out of. And I think stories that are happening right now are different from stories that happened in the past in some ways, but in some ways not. And there's a lot you can learn or just enjoy from hearing stories from the past. So I kind of think that in itself is enough reason to preserve them.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking time today out of a, I know, crazy day. And I think this has been a real pleasure for our viewers, certainly for me. And maybe I'll interview you before 22 years from now. But thank you so much, Lily.
Thank
really
you.
Appreciate it.
It was really nice to talk to you.
You too. You too. Take care.
Right.